Welcome to the panel discussion, Globalization Beyond 2020. Time for a reset? Hosted by New York University's Stern School of Business and DHL. Directly from the DHL Innovation Center in Troisdorf, Germany, here is our moderator, Sarah Kelly.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we're talking about the state of globalization. How has the coronavirus pandemic impacted global flows? And what is the outlook as we head into next year and beyond? Joining us to discuss, we have a very distinguished panel. John Pearson is the CEO of DHL Express. Catherine Mann is Global Chief Economist at Citibank. Ian Golden is Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford. And Steve Altman is Senior Research Scholar at the NYU Stern School of Business and the lead author of the DHL Global Connectedness Index. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today to share your insights. And Steve, I'd like to actually begin with you because I just mentioned the DHL Global Connectedness Index, which you have just released. There are some really interesting findings there. And we have to mention that, this is being released against the backdrop of globalization being under great strain over the past year. There's been the coronavirus pandemic. There's been the worst economic downturn in modern memory. And yet it wasn't all doom and gloom for the index. What surprised you about 2020?
Yes, that's true. So it wasn't all doom and gloom for globalization in 2020. In terms of upside surprises, I would say two main areas where the index turned out better than we were expecting. One is trade, and the other is information flows. So trade flows plummeted at the beginning of the pandemic, trade shrinking faster than during the global financial crisis, faster than during the Great Depression. But the second half of 2020, trade came roaring back to the extent that as of September, the volume of trade in goods was back to within 2% of its pre-pandemic level, something I could not have imagined we were going to see back in March or April. On the information flows side, as our in-person interactions were cut off to prevent the spread of the virus, digital flows just surged this year. We saw the growth rate of cross-border internet traffic roughly doubling, very large growth in international e-commerce sales. And people were questioning, will the coronavirus break the internet? No, the infrastructure held and we stayed connected online.
Okay, and Catherine, I'd like to turn to you now and ask you how you are feeling, in fact, about 2020. Because we know Citi is really unique in terms of its global footprint. You've also held senior positions in the public sector as well. So through that lens, I'd like to ask you what sort of challenges you have seen. But first, perhaps you can just highlight any developments that perhaps gave you a sense of optimism in 2020 about the state of global connectedness right now.
Well, I have to say I'm not going to be quite as optimistic as what's been in the index, because there are a couple of elements of it that I find challenging. One is the fact that we have substituted digital for in-person. So there's a substitution there. That's not really the same as rising in information flows, the kind of information flows that would be associated with the flows about people that we are very concerned about with regard to privacy and security. That's not really about the information flows between businesses that is associated with distributed place of production. So, I think the information flow surprise actually has some challenges in it that I would see going forward that we would worry about. The other place that I see some challenges is on the financial flows. Now, this was put forward as an area where there had been a contraction, a retreat of globalization, but some prospects for rebound. The retreat, of course, being in foreign direct investment, some question marks about revival of foreign direct investment going forward. But the part of the sort of the flows that I think was a challenge going forward is on the portfolio side, not just portfolio equity, but portfolio debt. And the reason why this is a challenge, of course, is if there's a substitution of portfolio equity and portfolio debt for FDI, these are the kinds of flows that create challenges, especially for emerging markets. And that response to sort of this substitution might be to try to contain those flows because of concerns about volatility. So these two areas, information flows and financial flows, are ones where the index, the way the index is displayed, might mask some concerns, sort of some termites in the woodwork, so to speak, that we would have to pay attention to going forward.
And we're going to get more on that for sure, because I want to get more details on what exactly that you are seeing. But first, I'd like to turn to you, Ian, and gauge your mood, because we know you're coming at this from the perspective of being one of the leading voices on globalization, development, digital transformation. You're often looking at this from a longer term perspective. When you've described this point in history, when you've described globalization in the past, you've used words like new renaissance, like revolutionary. And I'm wondering if that still holds true for you for 2020, or if perhaps you might be rethinking it a little bit.
Well, I'm optimistic. I think we're at an inflection point. This pandemic was entirely predictable. It's the underbelly of globalization, what I've called the butterfly defect of globalization before. But if it's a wake-up call that teaches us to manage globalization more effectively, I think it will bring in the long run good. This could be the pandemic to stop pandemics if we understand the underlying forces. And of course, it could stop financial crises, and it could accelerate action on climate change and many other areas. And I've been encouraged by some of the dimensions which the DHL Connectedness in this index has really highlighted, have stood up. I mean, one is this incredible surge in supply of medical equipment. Now we're seeing with vaccines, of course, that is an epitome of globalization. We wouldn't be saved without globalization. So that is incredible. The way that trade has held up in many respects, I mean, for example, the Pacific trade between China and the US has been stronger in many dimensions than ever in history. And we're seeing that in investment in China is actually up on all global records in many dimensions, not at least in finance. We're seeing the rebound in that region. So the economic center of gravity is moving more rapidly. Steve spoke about the digital flows. That's been quite remarkable, how robust that pickup's been. If this had happened 20 years ago, we'd have a very, very different outcome from it. And I think the other thing that's been remarkable globally has been the coordinated stimulus amongst the wealthy countries in terms of fiscal stimulus. $12 trillion. That's a big, big, unprecedented event. If you'd said we'd do this in January, we would have thought that would be much too much. The missing piece, and perhaps we'll come back to that, is that there hasn't been solidarity with developing countries. They've got less than 1% of the money. And so they are going to really suffer the burden of this economically. And that has an implication going forward for how globalization plays out.
Absolutely, and we are most certainly going to come back to that a little bit later in the conversation. But first, John, I'd like to turn to you and get your perspective on this, because as we mentioned, you're the CEO of DHL Express, which is the market leader in international express services. So through that lens, you've really had a front seat to 2020. Yeah. You experienced firsthand these shifts in trade patterns and supply chains. What have been your observations when it comes to the state of global connectedness in the past year?
I like that being called you're in the front seat. Yeah, I think we're a good barometer for some of these things, and I can put some meat on the bone of what Steve and Ian said there, especially so. I think the V that we saw, our slowest month was April. Our slowest week was week 15 as it was, but the V was a very narrow V. In fact, the exit of the V was higher than the entry to the V. So the exit of our drop was more robust than the trading levels that we went into it. And you might wonder why that was. I think there are three things that I would say really drove that. Firstly, in February and March, we were moving PPE, as Ian said, into China. The world was helping China with PPE and moving ventilators that had literally hundreds of parts coming from 10 or 15 or 20 different countries. That PPE boom, which put an enormous crunch on aviation capacity, which we'll probably talk about later, simmered down and was replaced by an e-commerce boom. E-commerce really started taking off in April and May, and many people have heard the phrase 3 years of e-commerce growth in 3 months. That was 3 months at that point, and that's exactly the case. There was absolutely some nitrous oxide put into that sort of e-commerce part of our business, which is now nearly 1 in 2 shipments of every shipment we move, 1 in 2 is an e-commerce shipment. And then the third thing I would say, which talks to the resilience of global trade, or the momentum that trade had before the pandemic, is that B2B started recovering. The I have, you want, I have, the need for things to get replaced, parts to get repaired, things to be sold, things to be bought, sort of kicked in sort of July, August, and by September we were firmly on a very strong footing. The companies that had optionality and a broader supply base or distribution center set up fared a lot better than those that were just in one country. But I think the general view of our trading lines this year really talked to the momentum that pre-existed COVID and how self-resuscitating global trade is.
And I'm wondering, Catherine, if you agree with that assessment right now from John, when we're talking about the resilience of global supply chains. What are you seeing on your side, for example? Because I'd like to, begin a round now of questions where I ask you, what do you see as the biggest challenges right now to globalization? Is this one of them?
Are you saying the biggest challenge to globalization is sort of the resilience of supply chains? So a couple things. One is, I think it is important to make a distinction in globalization between trade in goods and trade in services. And when we talk about the sort of the recovery, the V shape that we are seeing in global trade, and frankly, even our 2 month forward leading indicator really only has trade in goods coming back to zero growth for the year. So I think that I'm a little concerned that we're raising the mission accomplished victory flag on the recovery of global trade, even in goods, a little bit prematurely. But of course, the most rapidly growing part of trade has been services, and this is of course of particular interest to advanced economies. That's where the trade growth has been the greatest, and where the share of trade in services, if we think about goods and services as being what we think about as trade, that still is way on the back foot, dramatically on the back foot. And that's just about tourism. It's more broadly about business exchange as well. So, and as I say, some of that has been substituted using digital flows, but not all of it, and not really in the same way. So I think that there's some concerns. But if we narrow our focus and talk about supply chains, there's a lot in the report that I think is fascinating about supply chains, particularly with regard to the two measures of globalization. There's the depth, as in how important globalization is for an individual country, but then the breadth, which is how many partners you have. And I think going forward, we've resuscitated the partnerships that were in place for trade in goods, and I think that we've definitely heard that with regard to the front seat DHL Express. They have been exactly party to that resuscitation of the existing supply chain relationships. But one of the things going forward that I think is most interesting to ask is companies over the past couple of years have had 3 different shocks to their supply chains. They've had climate shocks, they've had COVID shocks, and they've had China shocks, meaning especially the U.S.-China trade war. And those shocks have made them reassess how they want to structure their supply chains. Now, Ian brought up climate. I think climate is a much more important determinant of supply chains going forward I think it's an area for the next DHL competitiveness index. Connectedness index should be talking about how the climate dimension is going to change competitiveness. Is it going to change depth? Is it going to change breadth? Is it going to change information flows? Because I think it will. I think that supply chains will be reassessed based on their carbon footprint. That will lead to a more diversified production structure. How do you make that cost effective? Because the report does talk about the costs associated with having a diversified production structure. The way you make that cost effective is by more effective use of technology, and particularly B2B within the plant, within the structure of the company, between plants, information flows. But we have to ask the question about information flows. There are very different views about privacy and security when it comes to information flows, not just B2B, of course, but even more explicitly with regard to consumer information. So to me, these are the issues we've recovered, where we've resuscitated the supply chains, and even we did better because in some sense the policy report, the policy response that Ian mentioned on the fiscal side was to replace income. People couldn't spend income on services, right, because of lockdowns. So they spent income on goods. And we see that in the supply chains that have been resuscitated so far. But where are we going to be going forward?
Really, really fascinating. And actually, as you've been speaking, I've been watching Steve nodding his head. So I want to give him a chance to weigh in and comment on all of those areas that you've highlighted, because we know that the index that you've put forward, Steve, it actually says in it that it's a comprehensive health check for globalization. So, where are these acute areas of weakness, would you say? Perhaps you can react to some that Catherine has set forward for us.
Oh, sure. So those were, I think many very helpful points, and the climate link will be very, very interesting to explore going forward. I particularly liked the comment on resuscitating supply chains, because I think we've been kind of in a debate between, do we need more redundancy, so diversify the supply chains, or do we need more reshoring, bring them back home? And I've wondered how much of it is going to end up with a different reversion to status quo, because that also tends to happen given cost pressures. But I thought that was very helpful. In terms of the biggest weakness this year was definitely the people flows. So kind of shifting direction. It was the fact that international travel is down 70%. We've rolled back 3 decades of growth in international travel, and that not traveling isn't, and I think this also comes back to one of your points, Catherine, that not traveling isn't just the loss of, it's not just the loss of being able to be close to loved ones, it's not just the terrible hit to the tourism sector and to countries that depend on tourism. Travel is an important enabler of trade, important enabler of investment, important enabler of learning across borders, and until we're able to travel again, it's going to be a major drag on really the whole globalization phenomenon.
Okay, thank you so much. Ian, I'd like to get you to weigh in now, because I know when you first spoke, you highlighted your optimism, in fact, for globalization. But you also highlighted, this so-called butterfly defect. So in other words, that globalization spreads opportunities, but also risks. What other risks do you see, or did you see, in 2020? And perhaps you'd also like to react to what we've heard from Steve and Catherine.
Absolutely, thank you. I think the 3 big risks are, first, that what hasn't globalized, in fact, what's gone backwards, is politics. Countries are less connected with each other, and unless countries coordinate, as we've seen dramatically with the pandemic, but as we see on climate change, in finance, in digital security, and many other areas, unless countries coordinate and recognize that they need to also be more joined up, we cannot manage globalization. And that has been the big missing piece during COVID. Very different, by the way, to the 2008-2009 crisis, when another Republican in the White House, George W. Bush, stepped up to the plate, convened a G7 at heads of state level, a G20, massive coordinated effort, which really did make the significant difference then. We've had the opposite this time with the US withdrawing. So the first and biggest risk is globalization's lack of political coordination. I hope that can be fixed. The WHO obviously needs urgent reform. So does the WTO need to have a head and to be reformed, and other organizations, and certainly climate change too. The second big risk is that globalization spreads risk, and therefore we need to establish a much more resilient system. Pandemics were inevitable, but so were financial crises and more, cyber attacks, climate change, and so on. They can be stopped. There's no reason not to have a more resilient and more secure, sustainable globalization, but that requires the sorts of actions that we've seen happen this year with fiscal, with behavior change, with many other things. And the third big risk is that globalization increases inequality. Some do much better than others. Some countries, some places, within countries, different places, different groups do better. And that requires for intervention both at the global level and the national level to be more active. Unless you have a redistribution of the gains to the losers and help the losers not only find a job, have a social security net, but also get to the places. These places are geographically different. So get from the Midwest to where the new jobs are, for example, move. And that's true around the world. It's not going to be resilient because people, as we've seen, reject. The people that don't like globalization are not the people that do well out of it. And that's why Asia, particularly East Asia, is very enthusiastic about globalization. It's the people that lose their jobs, that lose their incomes, that get more insecure, that don't like it. That requires and can be resolved politically. If I may just react briefly to what Catherine said, if I could, I completely agree on climate change. We're already seeing it. I mean, it's interesting to see that one of the biggest manufacturers for Apple has said that they're unlikely to be able to continue production in Japan because it doesn't do enough renewable power. So it's beginning to drive supply chains. The second big thing I think that's being left out is technology. It's not only climate change, but automation. And all of these big shifts in supply chains were happening already before COVID-19. It revealed them, it's exacerbated them, but nothing is new from COVID-19. The automation process was leading to a reshoring. The just-in-time delivery of e-commerce was leading to reshoring. The customization and the politics were all well before COVID. What's new is the speed of this, that it's happening. And I think that is very different. The only thing that's really changed because of COVID, I think that shifted, is business travel, which is going to be permanently reduced. And that, again, is because of growing concerns on climate change, on carbon emissions, but also cost and efficiency. We've really learned to have many business meetings. So that's the only thing that I think is actually going to be permanently wouldn't have happened otherwise in the way it's happening for a very long time.
And I'd just like to pick up on that theme of inequality that you actually introduced as part of your answer, Ian, and turn a question to John now about the prospects for a vaccine. Because inequality really comes up when we're talking about a vaccine. We know that DHL is involved in some efforts when it comes to vaccine logistics. Talk us through, how this shows the importance of globalization and how you are approaching it from your perspective.
I think, first the operational side. So we've been, for the last 2 or 3 months, heavily involved with some of the producers of vaccines in terms of working through the ways in which these vaccines can be distributed. In a sense, the vaccine distribution is right in our wheelhouse. These packages and these containers, in the case of Pfizer, can contain the goods and the vaccines at -80, -90 for 10 days. Our standard transit time varies between 1 and 5, so we even have a little bit of a buffer at the end of that. 1 and 5 days to get something from origin, which is manufacturing site, right through to destination. That's not airport, that's through to Ministry of Health's warehouse, that's through to hospital, that's through to clinic. So it's what we do every day anyway. We're operative in 220 countries. It would be good to think that all 220 countries were receiving the vaccine. So we have the capability already to move into these countries. There'll be some areas where dry ice permits or dangerous good permits need to be fully validated, but by and large, all those are done, and we're meeting the requirements of the producers to a huge degree. Some will be moved by bulk, some will be moved in bulk, and some will be moved in express mode. I think the main thing, there's only two aspects to it, that it is dangerous goods and dry ice, and we have active loggers that sit on the side of a package to ensure that we're able to demonstrate that the package has maintained the right temperature sensitivity. And then I think it's a great example for connectedness and globalization in the sense of partnership and collaboration on, I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist or even in the pharmacy business, but you have to think that the partnership and the collaboration on this particular project and the distribution of the vaccines from what is a small number of origins to a huge number of destinations is a great example of exactly that.
And indeed, we're talking about how globalization can help support the recovery now. Ian, just briefly tell us, because you've spoken about this before, tell us about how we can counter vaccine nationalism, for example.
Well, I think it's going to be absolutely essential, and it's very inspiring to hear John speak about, getting ready for it and to 222 countries. That's the first way to overcome it, is make sure you can get it there physically in the right way, but then as a protected good. The second, of course, is affordability. And that's going to require massive transfers, I think, of funding. There's COVAX, there's Gavi, there are different initiatives which have been initiated. They're not getting sufficient donor funding. But we're going to need that capability. And I think we're also going to need an open source intellectual property. The Oxford vaccine, which I'm obviously partial to because it's being manufactured by friends up the road, that is open source. That's going to be manufactured in many places, and it's going to be very, very cheap. It's going to go for like $2 a vaccine compared to closer, I think, to 30 for the other vaccines. So, and it can be stored in a regular fridge. They're all important. And so I think part of the thing is not to compete between vaccines, but let as many as possible into the market as widely as possible, get global solidarity behind it in terms of financing it. The rich countries need to basically pay to allow this to be global. It won't be overcome until everyone in the world has access. And of course, then the tremendously important things which John pointed to, which is from manufacturing to the patient, how you get that whole logistic chain sorted is absolutely key. And it's very reassuring to know that groups like DHL have got their heads around this already, because that's what we're going to need.
Okay, so we continue our conversation now on how globalization can help support the recovery. Catherine, I'm turning to you. Yeah. Take us to the economy now, because you've made the following assessment that the rebound is not going to be strong enough to return us to January 2020. To what extent can globalization help to accelerate the recovery, and how do the public and private sectors need to be thinking now about this next phase?
So, the challenge going forward into 2021 is how do we get from a situation of having social distancing, having policies of lockdown, having those impact employment, incomes, consumption capabilities. How do we reverse that? How do we get beyond that? The vaccine, the critical ingredient, obviously, the logistics, critical as well, but that doesn't get us to the final destination, which is implementation. In other words, getting people to take the vaccine, which in a number of advanced countries, there still is question marks about. When you ask people, will you take it? They say, I'm not sure, for a variety of reasons. Not only do you get to that, have to get them to take it, but then you have to get people to believe that they now have immunity, and that they can go back to business as usual. And that may not even be business as usual. Plus, policymakers, with respect to their lockdowns, whether it be international borders or how many seats you can have in a restaurant, those policies have to be relaxed so that people can go back to normal. And again, I think as Ian pointed out, what normal means going forward, I think there's some question marks about structural changes on what it is that normal means. So there's actually a lot that needs to happen after the package that DHL Express delivers. After that package gets there, there's still an awful lot of behavioral change as well as policy changes that are necessary before we actually get to something that represents a return to the pre-COVID level of GDP. Now, that is a benchmark that we kind of use when we talk to our country economists. When do you think your countries are going to get back to the pre-COVID level of GDP? And for China, maybe it's now, Q3 2020. For the US, pretty optimistic, saying Q2 2021. For the Euro area, our economists in the Euro area are penciling in Q3 2022.
Wow.
That's a really long time from now. And that is only to the pre-COVID level of GDP. So if you're a business and you're thinking about what am I going to do for the next 2 years, where I haven't actually gotten back, up to the January of this past year, how do I manage my business under those circumstances? And of course, that's average. There are some businesses that are doing extremely well because of the rotation into consumer goods instead of services. But, so on average, though, we're talking 2 years for Europe to get back. And that's after 9 months of collapse and short recovery. So that's a very big challenge for business decision making about how to invest, how to engage with your workforce. It's a big challenge for policymakers. How do we manage a situation where we only get back to it takes 2 years to get back? And then I think going forward, the real question is, getting back to the pre-COVID level of GDP really is not a victory because, of course, there should have been on the global scale 3%, maybe 3.2% growth, depending on how you do your ratios and your averages and so forth. That's all lost. That's all GDP that we have not recovered. And who bears the burden of that lost GDP? We actually know a lot about this because we can go back to the global financial crisis and we can see exactly what happened back then. We lost about 5% of global GDP. It never returned to the previous trajectory. Who bore the burden? It was younger generations. And it's a cohort question. Younger generations go into a labor force and into work at a lower wage with a lower prospects for going forward. They bear a higher burden than others. Savers, especially those who choose to save in terms of deposits, not in terms of equities, they have a burden because of low interest rates for long, monetary policy response, appropriate, but nevertheless having consequences. And of course, the inequality that Ian mentioned that's within a cohort, the rich doing better and those who are not as well off, not doing as well. So a lot of burdens of not recovering lost GDP. And again, we know that because we already did that after the global financial crisis. It's data that we have in hand. So the real question going forward is, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? How do we make sure that we actually get the recovery, not just the rebound?
Absolutely. And that's something that we're most certainly going to talk about right now. In fact, Steve, I'd like to come to you with that now, because as we've heard Catherine articulate, and if I may, Catherine, we're in a hole right now. Getting out of the hole and back to the status quo is simply not good enough. So, the big question is if globalization, if development continues on its current trajectory, how does it develop in the next years, and what perhaps needs to be changed going forward to either reset or reinforce current trends in order to promote perhaps a fairer, a more inclusive globalization?
Yeah, so the data that Catherine was just sharing, it's a daunting challenge from the standpoint of just the projections of the global flows. It's a much narrower piece that we expect that the trade rebound will continue, but slower. We expect that so the FDI, the forecasts, as Catherine mentioned, it's a slow recovery expected for FDI. UNCTAD not expecting those flows to start growing again until 2022, and the people flows 2023, 2024, as we've talked about. In terms of globalization and macroeconomic recovery, the one lesson that we've had over and over, and that the index reinforces, is that the tendency is for the more connected countries to grow faster. And so that connecting more to global flows can be an accelerator for the recovery, but the challenge is a daunting one.
Ian, a fairer, more inclusive globalization, what specific actions take us there?
Well, firstly, I think we have no option. Unless we create a fairer, more inclusive globalization, it's going to basically unwind. By that, because if we don't, what we're going to have is increasingly polarized politics, increasing inability of countries to cooperate, and more crises, more pandemics, more climate change, more financial crises, etc. So we really have to, and that's why I don't like the way that people describe let's bounce back, because bouncing back to the old normal is to put us back on the track that got us to where we are. It would mean more of the same. And what we really want to do is not have more of the same once we get over this pandemic. So I hope it's a wake-up call for a different and better managed globalization going forward. What we need to do, firstly, at the global level, is coordinate much more effectively. There needs to be a realization that no country can be an island. There's no wall high enough that's going to keep out the risks we face, and that those high walls keep out the opportunities. As Steve has just mentioned, the more connected countries are, the better they grow, the better their people do. So that needs to be the first recognition. Roll back protectionism, roll back the nationalist tendencies, commit to global coordination. It doesn't have to all be global governance. There are many coalitions of actors, including groups like DHL, that can solve lots of the world's problems by working together in more effective ways if the politicians allow them to do so. The second crucial thing within countries is going to need to be much more solidarity. I think we're going to have stronger safety nets. We're going to have to help people create more flexible economies, allowing people to move, reskill, find the new jobs, and that's going to have to be a security. The countries that have the strongest safety nets actually are the most productive and the most flexible. The classic in Europe is Denmark on this front. So it really is important for productivity, which has been stagnating, but also to be able to navigate this very rapid transition we're going through, not least with automation. And then the third is overcoming inequalities globally, and that's going to require a much bigger commitment to international development. I think we're going to have a debt write-down of the 60 or so countries that are highly indebted. We're back to where we were in terms of these unsustainable debts. There's going to have to be much more private involvement in that because they're much bigger creditors, and certainly China and non-traditional lenders are going to have to be part of that. But the IMF, basically, World Bank and other institutions need to be recapitalized at much higher levels to make this possible. So I think we're going to have to, in order to make this more inclusive globally, accept that countries that have escalated their debt burdens through no fault of their own because of COVID-19, they are suffering from an economic emergency as a result of this, are going to have to be helped to get back onto their feet, and so that the Sustainable Development Goals can be put back on track. At the moment, they are being dramatically reversed. Talking about 125 million more people in extreme poverty this year. That has to be overcome.
And John, what do you see as the private sector's role in all of this? I'd like to ask you, because I know, for example, you have just one initiative. Perhaps you can also highlight others. One is called Go Trade, where, for example, you're focusing on developing countries and working together with international partners, sort of, bringing that together. Sure. Perhaps you can elaborate.
Yeah, no, I think we have a big role to play there. In the simplistic sense, we have an internal tagline that we're the experts in exports. For the last, 20 years, or nearly all of the 30 years I've been in DHL, we've been sponsoring Exporter of the Year awards. We've been driving the recognition of companies that exporting their way into the future as a source of growth is a very important thing to do. I remember as I became CEO of Europe in 2010, some of our fastest growing countries in Europe were Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And journalist after journalist after journalist said, how come you're growing so fast in these countries? And at that particular time, those particular markets recognized that selling domestically only was not going to be any salvation. So they were sort of exporting their way out of trouble, if you will. At that particular time, there was a benefit of exporting beyond the Eurozone and so on and so forth. And there were great brands. I remember Camper Shoes in Spain was one of them that started strong export profiles from Spain to the rest of the world. And that drives a shipment for us. Then in terms of programs like Go Trade, it's fascinating. It's already got a lot of momentum. It's been on the ground for around a year, although really only being accelerated now. We've got 15 or 16 programs globally, 9 of which are in Africa, and they're focused on 2 particular things. One is helping SMEs and e-commerce merchants understand how they can put their product on the world stage. And somewhat linked to that, or allied to that, you would say, the other aspect is helping countries and customs organizations in those countries facilitate import and export activity more easily than they have been able to do in the past. That's partly edification and education, but partly software and systems in relation to customs import processes and export and so on and so forth. So there's programs like Go Trade, but then there's a much broader, we've got our fingers in the pies of so many companies globally in 220 countries that all of them, and e-commerce is a fascinating example of this, that we're helping to understand that they can export and there's an interest in their product from outside of their own domestic market and they should take opportunity. And e-commerce is the best example of that.
Okay. We're talking about building a more sustainable globalization, and we just kind of jumped right into it. Catherine, I'd just like to follow up with you quickly and ask you actually if you can sort of reset this for us, because you've also done some work about where you've said that the inequality and the lack of productivity is due to globalization, that thinking is actually incorrect. That is something that you have debunked actually in your work. Talk with us about the public perception of globalization versus the reality of globalization, and what specifically needs to be changed.
So we've been sort of circling around this question, this set of topics in the course of our conversation here. And Ian brought it up very early, saying that globalization causes inequality. And that if that is true, and we can say in a model, we know that there are winners and losers from globalization. We also know that globalization expands the pie. And you can describe that in a number of different ways, but an easy way is to show the positive correlation between connectedness and growth, which is what is in the report, as well as the positive correlation between globalization and productivity growth. So you don't want to roll back globalization. It's not as if globalization rolling back is going to solve inequality. That's not the case. You solve inequality by using the fruits of globalization, the gains from trade, using econ speak. The gains from trade need to be properly distributed. That isn't a globalization story. That is a domestic policy story. So we have to get back to talking about how do domestic policies address the underpinnings of inequality, which is not just globalization, but as Ian said, automation and increasingly climate change. All of these are inequality generating shocks. And coming up with domestic policies that kind of address those come from having a bigger pie. Globalization, at least, gives you a bigger pie, which then you can choose to distribute or not. And I have to say, there has been either a lack of effort on the part of domestic policymakers to address this redistribution challenge. In some countries, it's just sort of left to the side. In other countries, in fact, there's been, policy choices have, if anything, exacerbated inequality. And it's not the fault of globalization that exacerbated inequality. It's a domestic policy choice. So it's not, it's not in our stars, it's in ourselves type of et tu brute. Specifically, we're talking about the need to come up with a domestic policy set, and Ian mentions Denmark as being sort of the iconic example, and Sweden are some others, where we address specifically that the gains are broad and the costs are narrow. One of the things in the report that I thought was interesting is that the report brought forward sort of this data on the very small share of a population that is immigrant, the very small share of production that is actually globalized, so it's about 1/5, so it's not tiny. It's this relatively small share of financial flows that are cross-border, and sort of saying that people's perception of globalization is much greater than the numbers.
Absolutely.
I worry about that. I worry about that because the perception is individual. Have I lost my job or not? Am I going to blame it on globalization? Am I going to blame it on nationalism? Am I going to blame it on climate? In some sense, it doesn't matter. I've lost my job, and certain regions are similarly affected. So this is a standard problem in economics where the cost or the brunt of the changes that we're talking about, whether it's globalization, whether it's climate, or whether it's automation, the brunt is narrowly borne. The gains of all this evolution, this great stuff, automation is great. Climate response will be great. The climate change obviously is not. And globalization, that is wide benefit. So the question always is, how do you take the wide benefit and distribute that appropriately to those who bear the brunt of the transformations that are actually generating these gains? That is a generic policy problem, and it has to be viewed head on. It can't be viewed as an extra thing to do.
It can't be viewed as an extra thing to do. Steve, I'd just like to give you the opportunity to respond because Catherine mentioned one part of the report, which is about people thinking international flows are in fact larger than they actually are. Perception. About how they distort the policy debate, or what you've been seeing playing out.
Sure, and to kind of build directly on Catherine's point there, I think this pattern that we see international flows are overestimated by the majority of the population, that people tend to think trade is much bigger than it is, immigration is much bigger than it is. I think that if we actually correct these misperceptions and help people to recognize that 80%, a little bit less of all economic activity is still domestic, it actually helps to get us focused back on exactly what Catherine and Ian were talking about, that if we really want to solve problems like inequality, we need to be focused on domestic policy. I think in the US context where I am based and where I'm from, I think about this contrast of just two data points, that the US on inequality measures among major advanced economies ranks first, on imports as a share of GDP ranks last, and not only last among the advanced economies, almost on the entire world. And so that, to me, I think these kinds of measures can help us to refocus the debate, to recognize that these kinds of problems, like inequality, the only way to solve them is through hard domestic policy compromises, which I think kind of brings us back to where Ian and Catherine were on that point.
Thank you so much, Steve. John, I'd like to turn to you next. And first of all, ask you a question that has come in actually from NYU faculty and students. And in combination with this question, also ask you what your final thoughts might be for this panel session, because we're almost nearing the end. The question that I have for you is, how will COVID alter, if at all, how multinational companies think about their supply chains?
I think I don't want to stretch the analogies or make erroneous comparisons, but we all remember the global financial crisis, and we know that was a relatively narrow V for DHL Express as well, but it took much longer to recover. We then had the ash cloud in 2010. So that was the ash cloud. People play it down a little bit, but it was actually 3 or 4 weeks when there wasn't one plane in the sky over Europe, apart from DHL planes, in fact. But everyone said they would re-engineer their supply chain after the ash cloud, and I'm not sure that really happened. Then we come to the pandemic today, and this is a trade blip caused by a medical event and a pandemic, which can't be underestimated, but it's not because of an economic situation that was pre-existing it. So I think people will look at fine-tuning their supply chains. Everything, when I talk to our customers and I talk to people that ship with us, those supply chains have been built on two things, efficiency and economics. They've worked so well for decades, certainly 2 decades, that they've been presumed and not even tested. So I think there will be some fine-tuning and finessing, and my colleagues may well disagree with me. I think the denim jean industry will remain in Bangladesh, and that's where things will be produced. For high-value parts, specialty parts, and some things where people are really nervous, I think maybe those things will be onshored, nearshored, whatever phrase you want to use. But I think the fundamental supply chains are maybe more of a China plus one, giving people optionality of manufacturing site, optionality of where their distribution centers are based. That may well happen, but I'm not expecting to see a wholesale change. And I talk to customers every day on this topic. So that would be my view for the student that was interested in that topic.
Thank you so much. Another student, Anne, has written to you and asked you the following question. How do you view the role of firms who control the flow of information, for example, Facebook and Twitter, or disinformation affecting the prospects for deepening globalization? For example, conspiracy theories like QAnon have gone global. Is there a responsibility for firms to control or moderate certain types of international flows?
Well, students always ask tough questions, so great to get them. Let me just begin by saying I totally agree with what Catherine was saying about the benefits of globalization. I'm a fierce advocate and defender of it and believe it needs to be fixed because it's brought more progress more quickly to more people than any process in history. And by globalization, it's the flows across national borders, most importantly, of ideas, of what works and what doesn't work, how you learn from others, and rights about people's rights and education, literacy. And so this question that the students posed, it goes to the absolute heart of it because it's about these information flows and highlights a very, very important aspect of globalization, which is you have to harvest the benefits from vaccines to good ideas that are flowing on how to manage economies, on human rights, on literacy and everything. And you have to stop the bads, whether it's trafficking in bad things, weapons, or whatever else, terrorism, and of course, these ideas. Now, I think there's going to be a massive debate about what is the liability and responsibility of these platforms, these social media platforms and others. In the case of newspapers, if someone published something that was untrue, we could go for them and they wouldn't be in trouble. In the case of these platforms, they can spread conspiracy theories, which are killing people. Anti-vaccination movements, for example, will kill people, and so do many other jihadist ideas and other ideas. They are deeply destructive, based on, in fact, I think we're going to have to get into a regulatory environment. This is extremely controversial because it touches on all these questions of freedom, liberty, self-expression, and everything else. But I think we are going to have to get into an environment where if you have a platform that propagates ideas which are evidently not true, and which have a very destructive outcome and could lead to the deaths of people, that one has to have some responsibility. Now, how that works through and what that does to these platforms is going to be, I think, one of the biggest and most important questions that's going to be challenged in the coming years. And it's clearly one that's already very much on the inbox of people moving into the White House and other places. And it certainly is in Brussels as well with the European Commission. But I think we're going to have to see a transformation. The other final point I'd make, especially to students, is that this is a battle of ideas. And one of the reasons that bad ideas triumph is because people that with good ideas don't express them enough and aren't engaged in these battles. And one of the things I love about the DHL Connectedness Index is it's part of that contribution of evidence-based of what works, how it happens. And it's that engagement that you are hosting today, which I think is a vital part of this too.
Thank you so much, Ian. Before we go now, I have a bit of a challenge actually for all of you, and I'd like to leave on a hopeful note and ask you if you can communicate to us in 3 sentences or less. If we were to have this conversation in 1 year from now, what do you hope has been achieved in the state of connectedness in our world? 3 sentences or less. Steve.
I hope that we've advanced the conversation about globalization in a way that it becomes more of a fact-based debate, that we're not just arguing about an abstract concept, but a set of actual flows that different countries participate in to different extent, that offers a variety of opportunities, and that's something real, practical, and tangible, rather than kind of ideological, so to speak.
Catherine?
I'm looking for a deeper political engagement across countries, a return to alliance building at the political level, but also at the corporate level, a greater appreciation of how the demand for visibility about climate, carbon footprint will actually change the domestic supply chains as well as the international supply chains. I think there's a demand for it. I think firms are going to have to respond to it. And so I do hope that we will see some evidence of that showing up in the structure of supply chains going forward, and that there will be political alliance support for that.
Ian?
I hope that everyone in a year's time in the world has a vaccine, and that this is firmly behind us. So thanks to DHL also for his help with that, but I hope that's happened. Secondly, I hope that we've learned to stop pandemics, that this has been the wake-up call, that we're in the Second World War, not the First World War. The First World War, of course, leading to more and more of a downward spiral, but the Second World War being the war to end all war and creating a totally different environment. And if we can realize that, as was certainly realized after the Second World War, with the creation of a new world order internationally and different systems domestically, we would have made progress. And the third thing, which is related to that, of course, is that we've learned about solidarity. The pandemic has taught us of the solidarity of young for old, of volunteerism, of all of these things. And what we need to now do, taking this forward, and I hope is expressed within the next year, is a solidarity within our countries to help those that have lost out desperately, lost loved ones, and a solidarity internationally with countries which have been devastated by the pandemic.
John, the final word.
I'd like to see an increasingly amount of good news in respect of trade liberalization policy. There's already a lot of good news going on there, and with our CEP program in Asia, so some more good news there. I'd like to think that e-commerce has driven more countries trading with more countries, and that small and medium-sized exporters in the developing world are taking their great products to the international stage. And thirdly, I'd like to see that the next Global Connectedness Index bears out the fascinating discussion we've had today, and that neither globalization nor trade is a 4-letter word.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us, for watching Globalization Beyond 2020, Time for a Reset. My name is Sarah Kelly. It's been a great pleasure to be your host. The conversation continues online. For anyone who wants to join in, you can follow the hashtag DHLGCI. Again, the hashtag is DHLGCI. And for those who are interested in the DHL Global Connectedness Index, you can also find it online. You can review it via the link that is now appearing on your screen. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us here today, and for all of you for watching. Take care.